Okay, guys, let's move on to part two. We left off by talking about the Freedmen's Bureau, and I realized there was one more thing I wanted to say about what it did. In addition to schools, the Freedmen's Bureau is also very, very significant for providing legal support and employment for freedmen. And that is something one could argue would have been much more difficult without the federal government's support. Okay, so moving on, let's think about how when Andrew Johnson becomes president after Lincoln's death, the presidential plan for Reconstruction evolves. So, Andrew Johnson, when he first entered the realm of politics, was actually politically a Jacksonian Democrat. So, despite the fact that he was Lincoln's running mate in his second election in 1864, he is not he's not particularly progressive with regard to the rights of freedmen and changing the Southern economy potentially to be more industrialized. But despite that, he still does not particularly care for the elite. He rejects the lifestyle and the hierarchical structure created by the Southern plantation owner. And that's important for us to remember. So he is a complex figure. But nonetheless, he was a self proclaimed white supremacist. Here's a quote from him at the bottom: "Damn the Negroes, I am fighting these traitorous aristocrats, their masters." So that means I'm not fighting to free the slaves, I'm fighting to hurt their masters. So in some ways, he's thinking that he's actually just taking the property of the masters away. He's not trying to liberate the people that he's taking. And he also agrees with Lincoln's position that the Civil War was more an issue, at least at first, of punishing the southern states from seceding in the first place. So Johnson has a plan that, at least on the surface, looks similar to Lincoln's plan. It's not called the 10% plus plan, but in terms of the figures, we could give it that nickname, right? So the key behind Johnson's plan is that it also was a very lenient plan, similar to Lincoln's. So it offered amnesty upon a simple oath, not an ironclad oath, to all except Confederate civil and military officers, and also those that had property that exceeded $20,000. And if that was the case, those people could actually apply for amnesty directly to the president himself. So that does not mean that they could not receive amnesty. They just had to go about it in a different way. So that's actually more lenient than Lincoln's plan there. He's willing to pardon virtually anyone. Now, there were some minimum conditions that were required with regard to the treatment of freedmen in these states, but they were, again, just the minimum expectations. So that meant that these former states had to repudiate or condemn slavery, the act of secession itself, and they also had to repudiate any state debts that they were carrying from the wartime. Johnson's plan allowed the creation of provisional governments in the former Confederate states, and these provisional, meaning temporary governments, were meant to oversee the elections that would take place during a constitutional convention. So, in other words, the effects of this plan. What they do is, first off, they take the voting rights or they disenfranchise some leading Confederates. But at the same time, a lot of the former planter aristocrats just get pardoned and go back to life as usual. They don't own slaves anymore, but in many circumstances, they still employ them. And it also brings a lot of these former people in power back to their previous political power, so they can run for office again, and they can also control many state organizations politically or, in some circumstances, economically too. The Republican Party was outraged by the result of this plan, especially, of course, the radical Republicans. They thought that the planter elite was basically reassuming control of the South, and that made them very angry. This cartoon, my class analyze this, you could pause and look at it, but essentially what this is articulating is that very little changed, according to the artist, between the period of the Emancipation Proclamation and the Reconstruction period itself. In fact, this seems to articulate that the Emancipation Proclamation period was much more peaceful and stable than the Reconstruction period that seemed a little bit more lawless. The North is getting increasingly concerned when Johnson is president that Reconstruction is going to turn in a different direction. So a lot of the southern states do not meet the requirements of Johnson's Reconstruction plan. But Johnson nonetheless pardons 13,500 people, and many of those were former Confederate officers. And because of that, many former states feel like they have permission or a mandate to be defiant towards the federal government and towards freed slaves. So that's going to allow things like the creation of the Ku Klux Klan and many other southern systems that almost recreate the social and economic hierarchy that existed in the South before the Civil War started. The Black Codes, by the way, are one of the major results of this Southern defiance. What they're going to do is pass their own laws, sometimes even at the local level, that largely separate blacks and whites, even if not in terms of freedom of, in terms of freedom of movement. I mean, I'm not saying that blacks and whites did not go to the same places sometimes, but it's sort of going to set up the Jim Crow era in a lot of ways. So the Black Codes were largely restricting the freedom of movement, actually. They placed limits on the kinds of jobs that freedmen could have. They often established curfews, and it was very, very difficult for freedmen to truly be free with the Black Codes in place, because still they were essentially establishing, the Black Codes that is, were establishing rules and regulations for how black people could exist if they remained in the South. And the most popular, or the, not popular, but the easiest job for freedmen to get and to maintain after the Black Codes were put in place was sharecropping. And we'll talk about sharecropping in detail in a little while. This is a period where we see Congress very dramatically deviate from the president. And of course, this is the first time in U.S. history where a president is impeached. So Congress first prevents any Southern congressional delegates from even participating in the Reconstruction plan. Congress creates a joint committee on Reconstruction. So committees in Congress specialize in a key problem or issue. So it's important for us to realize that they're serious enough about Reconstruction, especially their own congressional Reconstruction plan, that they're moving forward with this specific process. They pass a Freedmen's Bureau, or rather, they renew the Freedmen's Bureau charter the year after it starts, and Johnson vetoes it. And then just a month later, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which we'll just briefly elaborate on in a minute, is also vetoed by Johnson. But in a surprise reaction, Congress actually overrides both of these vetoes. And this is the first time in U.S. history that they're able to do this. And in case you're unaware of the process, it takes a 2/3 majority to overturn a presidential veto. And that's a significant majority. But nonetheless, that's easier to do during Reconstruction because many of the seceded states are still not yet participating in the federal government at this point. All right, I'm going to keep these short and sweet this series, so let's pause again and then move forward with radical Reconstruction in the next series. So thank you again and stay tuned.